The dust clouds, kicked up by the approaching horses, could be seen for miles across the Arizona desert. Thomas Begay sat motionless on his weathered porch, his calloused hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. At 73 years old, his dark eyes still held the sharpness of an eagle, and his weathered face told stories of decades spent under the unforgiving southwestern sun. The turquoise and silver bracelet on his wrist caught the dying light as he watched the riders approach his small ranch on the outskirts of the reservation. Thomas had lived on this land for over 40 years, ever since he returned from Vietnam with medals he never displayed and memories he rarely spoke about. The small ranch wasn't much to look at: a modest adobe house, a weathered barn, and a few acres where he raised sheep and horses. But it was his sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of war gradually faded into the rhythm of daily life, where the songs of his ancestors carried on the desert wind could still reach his ears. The three men who dismounted from their horses were not from around these parts. Thomas could tell immediately. Their clothes were too clean, their boots too new, and they carried themselves with the arrogant swagger of men who believed the world owed them something. The leader, a tall man with a scraggly beard and cold blue eyes, wore a black hat tilted at an angle that suggested he fancied himself some kind of gunslinger from an old Western movie. The other two flanked him like shadows, their hands resting casually near the guns at their hips. "You the old Indian who owns this spread?" the leader called out, his voice carrying a sneer that made Thomas's jaw tighten. The old warrior remained seated, his expression unchanged, though inside he felt the familiar stirring of something he thought he had left buried in the jungles of Southeast Asia. "I am Thomas Begay," he replied quietly, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who chose his words carefully. "This is my home." The bearded man spat into the dust and looked around with obvious disdain. "Name's Jake Morrison. These here my associates, Pete and Billy." He gestured to his companions with a casual wave. "We represent some business interests that have been looking at this piece of land. Seems there might be some valuable minerals underneath all this dirt." Thomas set down his coffee cup and stood slowly, his movements deliberate despite his age. Years of ranch work had kept him strong, and his 6-foot frame still commanded respect. "This land is not for sale," he said simply. Jake Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding mesas. "See, that's where you're wrong, old man. Everything's for sale if the price is right. And if it ain't for sale..." He let the threat hang in the air like smoke from a campfire. "You are on my property," Thomas said, his voice remaining calm, but carrying an edge that made the horses shift nervously. "I will ask you once to leave." Pete, a stocky man with nervous eyes, stepped forward. "Now hold on there, Chief. We ain't looking for trouble. We're just trying to have a civilized conversation about business." Thomas's eyes narrowed at the casual use of chief, a word that carried generations of disrespect and condescension. "My name is Thomas Begay. You will use it, or you will say nothing at all." Billy, the youngest of the three, laughed and reached for something hanging from his saddle. "Listen to this old-timer, acting all high and mighty. Maybe he needs to be reminded of his place." He pulled out a bottle of cheap whiskey and held it up mockingly. "Figured you might want this more than conversation. Heard you people have a fondness for firewater." The insult hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Thomas felt the familiar fire rising in his chest, the same anger that had carried him through rice paddies and jungle ambushes, the rage that had helped him survive when so many of his brothers had not returned home. But he also felt something else, the wisdom of his grandfather's teachings, the strength that came from knowing who he was and where he came from. "You know nothing about my people," Thomas said quietly, but his voice carried across the desert like thunder. "You come to my home, insult my heritage, and threaten me with your presence. This is not the first time men like you have tried to take what is not theirs." Jake Morrison's eyes hardened. "Men like us? You mean men who get things done? Men who don't live in the past, clinging to old ways that don't mean nothing in the modern world?" He gestured broadly at the simple ranch. "Look around you, old man. This is progress passing you by. You can either get on board, or you can get run over." Thomas stepped down from his porch, his boots making soft sounds in the dust. "I have been run over before," he said, his voice carrying memories of 1,000 battles, both physical and spiritual, by bullets and bombs, by prejudice and hatred, by men who thought they knew better than the people who had lived here for thousands of years. Yet here I stand." The three men exchanged glances, their bravado beginning to waver slightly in the face of the old man's unwavering presence. There was something about Thomas Begay that didn't fit their expectations. This wasn't the defeated, alcoholic stereotype they had expected to intimidate. This was something else entirely. "Look, we don't want any trouble," Pete said, though his hand remained near his gun. "Just hear us out. Our employers are prepared to make a generous offer for this land. More money than you've probably ever seen." Thomas shook his head slowly. "This land holds the bones of my ancestors. It holds the memories of my children's laughter, the tears of my wife when she passed on to the next world. You cannot buy memories with money. You cannot purchase the sacred with dollars." Billy took a swig from the whiskey bottle and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Sacred? It's just dirt and rocks, old man. Hell, we're doing you a favor. You could take the money and move somewhere nice, maybe get yourself a little trailer in town where you belong." The casual dismissal of everything Thomas held dear struck him like a physical blow. He thought of his grandfather, who had survived the long walk, the forced relocation of the Navajo people in the 1860s. He thought of his father, who had worked as a code talker in World War II, using the sacred Navajo language to help win a war for a country that had tried to erase that same language from existence. He thought of his son, who had died in a car accident 10 years ago, and whose spirit he still felt in the wind that whistled through the canyon walls. "You speak of things you do not understand," Thomas said, and for the first time, his voice carried a warning that made the horses step back nervously. "This is not just land to me. It is the breath of the earth, the heartbeat of my people. When you threaten to take it, you threaten to tear out my soul." Jake Morrison had heard enough. His patience, never very substantial to begin with, had worn thin. "Soul? Heartbeat? Listen to yourself, old man. This is the 21st century, not some fantasy movie. You're just another obstacle in the way of progress, and obstacles get removed." He nodded to Billy, who understood the signal immediately. The younger man raised the whiskey bottle high above his head, intending to smash it against the porch post as a show of dominance and disrespect. But as he brought it down, something unexpected happened. Thomas moved. Despite his age, despite the arthritis that sometimes made his joints ache in the morning, despite the decades that had passed since his last combat mission, Thomas Begay moved with the fluid grace of a warrior. His hand shot out and caught Billy's wrist just as the bottle reached the peak of its arc. For a moment, the two men stood frozen in that position, the old Navajo warrior and the would-be intimidator, their eyes locked in a battle of wills that transcended the physical. "You will not destroy anything on my land," Thomas said quietly, his grip tightening on Billy's wrist until the younger man's fingers began to go numb. "You will not disrespect my home." Billy tried to pull away, but Thomas's grip was like iron. Panic began to creep into the young man's eyes as he realized he had seriously underestimated the old warrior. In desperation, he twisted his body and used his free hand to crack the bottle against Thomas's shoulder. The glass shattered with a sharp sound that echoed across the desert, and amber liquid splashed across Thomas's shirt and the dusty ground. The three men expected to see the old warrior stumble backward, maybe fall, definitely show signs of pain or defeat. What they saw instead made their blood run cold. Thomas Begay smiled. It wasn't a smile of amusement or friendliness. It wasn't the smile of a grandfather watching his children play or a husband seeing his wife after a long day. This was something else entirely, a smile that spoke of battles fought in distant jungles, of survival against impossible odds, of a warrior's spirit that had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger than steel. The smile was the expression of a man who had faced death so many times that it had become an old friend. It was the smile of someone who had learned that true strength came not from avoiding pain, but from walking through it with dignity intact. It was the smile of a Navajo warrior who carried the wisdom of his ancestors and the courage of his own hard-won experience. Billy stumbled backward, the broken bottle falling from his nerveless fingers. Pete's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, while Jake Morrison found himself taking an involuntary step back despite his efforts to maintain his composure. "What the hell?" Billy whispered, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. Thomas brushed the glass fragments from his shoulder with casual indifference, his smile never wavering. "Is that the best you can do?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he was genuinely curious rather than angry. "You come to my home with threats and disrespect, and the most you can manage is to break a bottle?" The old warrior reached down and picked up one of the larger glass shards, turning it over in his weathered hands as if examining a piece of ancient pottery. In Vietnam, he said conversationally, I once saw a man try to kill me with a broken bottle. He was young like you, desperate like you, afraid like you. He looked up at Billy with those dark eyes that seemed to see right through to the younger man's soul. Would you like to know what happened to him? Billy's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. No sound came out. The casual way Thomas held the glass shard, the complete absence of fear or pain in his demeanor, the terrible certainty in his voice, it all combined to create a psychological effect that was far more intimidating than any physical threat could have been. Jake Morrison tried to regain control of the situation. Now see here, old man. We came here to make a deal, not to fight. But if you want to play games... He let his hand drift toward his gun, hoping the implied threat would restore his position of dominance. Thomas's smile widened slightly, and he dropped the glass shard back into the dust. Games? He repeated, the word carrying a weight that seemed to press down on the three men like a physical force. You think this is a game? The old warrior stood to his full height, and something about his posture changed. Gone was the peaceful rancher sitting on his porch. In his place stood something ancient and dangerous, something that had been forged in the fires of war and tempered by the wisdom of the ages. The setting sun painted him in shades of red and gold, making him appear like a figure from legend stepping out of the pages of history. I have played games with death itself, Thomas said quietly. I have danced with violence in places where the earth was soaked with blood and the air thick with smoke. I have seen good men die and evil men prosper, and I have learned that there is only one rule that truly matters in this world. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it became almost unbearable. In that silence, the three men could hear the distant cry of a hawk, the whisper of wind through sagebrush, the eternal heartbeat of the desert itself. What rule? Pete asked despite himself, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas's smile transformed into something that might have been genuine warmth, but his eyes remained as hard as obsidian. Never mistake a man's patience for weakness, he said. Never assume that because someone chooses peace, they have forgotten how to wage war. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. These three men had come expecting to intimidate an old, lonely rancher. Instead, they had awakened something that they were completely unprepared to face. The broken bottle had been intended as an act of dominance, a way to show the old Indian his place in their world. Instead, it had become a catalyst that revealed the true nature of the man they were trying to threaten. As the sun continued its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of fire and shadow, the confrontation entered a new phase. What had begun as a simple business proposition backed by implied threats had become something much more complex and dangerous. The three would-be intimidators found themselves face to face with a force they had not expected and did not understand. Thomas Begay stood in the gathering dusk, glass fragments at his feet, and that terrible smile on his weathered face, looking every inch the warrior his enemies had learned to fear decades ago in a different desert on the other side of the world. The battle lines had been drawn, not with words or weapons, but with the breaking of a bottle and the smile that followed. The silence that followed Thomas's words stretched across the desert like a taut wire ready to snap. Jake Morrison found himself staring into the face of a man who seemed to have stepped out of his worst nightmares. The casual confidence he had carried into this confrontation was evaporating like morning dew under the desert sun. This was not going according to plan. You're making a mistake, old man, Jake said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried just minutes before. We represent serious people with serious money. People who don't like to be told no. Thomas's smile never wavered as he brushed the last of the glass fragments from his shirt. Serious people, he repeated, as if tasting the words. Let me tell you about serious people, young man. The old warrior walked slowly to one of the fence posts that marked the boundary of his property. Carved into the weathered wood were symbols that the three men couldn't read. Traditional Navajo markings that spoke of protection, of home, of the sacred bond between the people and the land. Thomas ran his fingers over the carvings with reverent care. My grandfather was a serious man, Thomas began, his voice carrying across the desert evening like an ancient prayer. He was 10 years old when the soldiers came to force our people to leave this land. 10 years old when he watched his family driven from their homes like animals. They called it the long walk, 400 miles through desert and mountains to a prison camp in New Mexico. Pete shifted nervously from foot to foot, his eyes darting between Thomas and the lengthening shadows. That was a long time ago, old-timer. Ancient history. We're talking about the here and now. Thomas turned to face him, and Pete involuntarily stepped backward. The old man's eyes held depths that seemed to contain centuries of pain and wisdom. Ancient history? Thomas asked softly. The genocide of my people is ancient history? The theft of our children, the destruction of our sacred sites, the systematic attempt to erase us from existence. This is ancient history. Billy, still shaking from his encounter with the broken bottle, tried to rally his courage. Look, we didn't come here for a history lesson. We came here to make a deal. You can either take our offer, or we can make things difficult for you. Your choice. The threat hung in the air like poison smoke. Thomas studied the young man's face, seeing fear masquerading as bravado, weakness disguised as strength. It reminded him of another young man from long ago, in a place where the air smelled of cordite and death. Difficult for me, Thomas repeated thoughtfully. Let me share something with you about difficulty, boy. The old warrior's mind drifted back to a day 48 years ago, to a jungle clearing in Vietnam where the screams of wounded men mixed with the chatter of automatic weapons. He had been 25 then, a Marine Lance Corporal who had volunteered for a reconnaissance mission that everyone knew was likely a suicide run. I was once pinned down by enemy fire for 3 days, Thomas said, his voice taking on a distant quality as he relived the memory. 3 days without food, without water, with bullets whistling over my head every time I tried to move. My radio was dead, my ammunition was almost gone, and 2 of my squad mates were bleeding out in the mud beside me. Jake Morrison found himself drawn into the story despite his intentions. There was something hypnotic about the old man's voice, something that demanded attention and respect. On the second night, Thomas continued, a sniper put a bullet through my shoulder, the same shoulder you just hit with your bottle, as a matter of fact. He rolled his shoulder experimentally, as if testing for damage. The pain was considerable. But pain, I learned, is just another form of information. It tells you you're still alive, still fighting, still refusing to quit. Billy swallowed hard, his earlier bravado crumbling like a house of cards in a windstorm. What happened? Thomas's smile returned, but now it carried memories of a different kind of battle. On the 3rd day, the enemy made a mistake. They got impatient. They came looking for us, thinking we were too weak to fight back. They found out they were wrong. The old warrior's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the desert silence, every word carried with crystal clarity. I learned something important that day. I learned that a man can endure almost anything if he knows who he is and what he's fighting for. I learned that the body may break, but the spirit is unbreakable. Pete looked around nervously, suddenly aware of how isolated they were, how far from any help or backup. Listen, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Maybe we can work something out that benefits everyone. Thomas nodded slowly, as if considering the proposition. Work something out, he repeated. You know, that's exactly what Captain Phillips said to me after I dragged 6 wounded Marines out of that jungle. He wanted to work something out too. The 3 men waited, held captive by the story despite their growing unease. Captain Phillips was a good man, Thomas continued. But he was also a practical man. He looked at me, a Navajo kid from the reservation who had just spent 3 days in hell, and he saw a problem. You see, what I had done was supposed to be impossible. The official report said that position was overrun, everyone killed. But there I was with 6 living, breathing contradictions to that report. Thomas walked over to his porch and sat back down, his movements casual, but somehow predatory, like a cat settling into a comfortable position from which to watch its prey. So Captain Phillips wanted to work something out. He wanted to change the story, make it simpler, more believable. He offered me a promotion, a medal, a transfer to a cushy job in the rear. All I had to do was sign a statement saying the official version was correct. Jake Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. What did you do? I told him the truth, Thomas said simply. I told him that those 6 Marines had families who deserved to know their sons and husbands were alive. I told him that the truth was not negotiable, no matter what incentives he offered. The old warrior's eyes grew distant again, looking back across the decades to a moment that had defined him as much as any battle. Captain Phillips was not happy with my response. He made it clear that refusing his generous offer might have consequences. He said things could become difficult for a young Indian who didn't know his place. Billy felt his mouth go dry. So what happened? Thomas's smile returned, but now it carried an edge that made all three men take an unconscious step backward. I smiled at him, Thomas said quietly, just like I'm smiling at you right now. And do you know what Captain Phillips saw in that smile? None of the three men dared to answer. He saw the same thing you're seeing, Thomas continued. He saw a man who had walked through hell and come out the other side. He saw someone who had faced death so many times that threats no longer carried any weight. He saw a warrior who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. Thomas stood up again, and this time all three men instinctively moved back several steps. The casual nature of their retreat was not lost on any of them, least of all the old warrior himself. Captain Phillips decided that maybe the truth wasn't so bad after all, Thomas said conversationally. Those 6 Marines got to go home to their families. I got my medal and my promotion, and Captain Phillips learned something important about the difference between respect and fear. Jake Morrison tried to summon his earlier bravado, but it felt like trying to light a match in a hurricane. That's a nice story, old man. Real inspiring. But this isn't Vietnam, and we're not soldiers. This is business, pure and simple. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. You're right. This is not Vietnam. He gestured broadly at the land around them. This is much more important. In Vietnam, I was fighting for my country, for my brothers in arms, for ideals I believed in. Here, I'm fighting for my soul. The old warrior's voice took on a quality that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the desert. This land is not just property to me. It is where I buried my father and my grandfather. It is where I scattered my wife's ashes when the cancer finally took her. It is where my son took his first steps and spoke his first words in the language of our people. Thomas walked over to where Billy stood, still pale from his earlier encounter with the broken bottle. You see that mountain? He asked, pointing to a distant peak silhouetted against the darkening sky. That is where I went to fast and pray when I came back from the war. For 4 days and 4 nights, I sat on that mountain with no food, no water, asking the spirits of my ancestors to help me find peace. Billy followed his gaze, seeing nothing but rock and shadow. What does that have to do with anything? Everything, Thomas replied simply. On the 4th night, as I sat there weak with hunger and thirst, a coyote came and sat beside me. We looked at each other for a long time, and I saw something in its eyes that I recognized. I saw a survivor. The old warrior's voice grew softer, more introspective. The coyote taught me something that night. It taught me that survival is not about being the biggest, or the strongest, or the most feared. Survival is about adaptation, about knowing when to fight, and when to fade into the shadows, about understanding that sometimes the greatest victory comes from simply refusing to be destroyed. Pete was growing increasingly agitated. Look, this is all very touching, but we've got a job to do here. Our employers aren't going to be happy if we come back empty-handed. Thomas turned his attention to the stocky man, and Pete immediately regretted speaking. Tell me about these employers of yours, Thomas said quietly. What kind of people send 3 armed men to threaten an old man on his own land? Jake Morrison decided it was time to reassert control of the situation. The kind of people who have the money and connections to make your life very unpleasant if you don't cooperate. The kind of people who can tie you up in legal battles for years, or make sure your water rights get mysteriously revoked, or have tax assessments that suddenly double or triple. The threats were delivered with the casual confidence of a man who had used them successfully many times before. But, as Jake watched Thomas's face, he realized that his words were having no effect whatsoever. If anything, the old warrior seemed almost amused. Legal battles, Thomas repeated thoughtfully. You know, I fought a few of those too. When I came back from Vietnam, the government tried to claim this land for a mining operation. Said they needed the mineral rights for national security purposes. Thomas walked over to his pickup truck and reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a weathered manila folder. I fought that battle for 7 years. 7 years of lawyers and judges and bureaucrats who looked at me like I was something they had scraped off their shoes. 7 years of depositions and hearings and appeals. He opened the folder and pulled out a yellow document. holding it up for the three men to see. This is the court order that confirmed my ownership of this land. Signed by a federal judge who admitted that the government's case was built on forged documents and false testimony. 7 years, and I won every single round. Billy stared at the document, as if it were a venomous snake. How did you do it? Thomas carefully placed the document back in the folder. The same way I survived in Vietnam. The same way my grandfather survived the long walk. The same way my father survived fighting in a war for a country that wouldn't even let him vote when he came home. I remembered who I was and what I was fighting for. The old warrior's voice carried a weight of certainty that seemed to press down on the three men like a physical force. You see, gentlemen, you have made a fundamental error in your calculations. You have assumed that I am afraid of you, afraid of your employers, afraid of the consequences of refusing your generous offer. Thomas's smile returned, and with it came that terrible sense of facing something far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. But I'm not afraid. I stopped being afraid 48 years ago in a jungle clearing where I learned that death is just another enemy that can be faced with dignity and courage. I am not afraid of your legal battles, or your bureaucratic harassment, or your implied threats of violence. The desert wind picked up, stirring the dust around their feet and carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. In that wind, the three men seemed to hear the whispers of ancient voices, the songs of a people who had endured everything that could be thrown at them and had survived to sing another day. I am 73 years old, Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I have buried more friends and family than you have years on this earth. I have faced enemies with guns and grenades and the full backing of foreign governments. I have survived cancer, car accidents, and the slow, grinding poverty that is the legacy of a people who were robbed of everything they had. He stepped closer to Jake Morrison, and the younger man felt an almost overwhelming urge to turn and run. So tell me, Thomas said quietly, what exactly do you think you can do to me that life hasn't already tried? The question hung in the air, like a challenge thrown down before the gods themselves. In the gathering darkness of the desert evening, with the stars beginning to appear overhead, and the coyotes starting their nightly chorus in the distance, three men who had come to threaten an old warrior found themselves facing the uncomfortable realization that they were completely out of their depth. Thomas Begay stood before them, glass fragments at his feet, and that terrible, knowing smile on his weathered face, looking every inch the survivor his grandfather had been, the warrior his father had raised him to be, the protector his ancestors had taught him to become. The broken bottle had been intended to intimidate and humiliate. Instead, it had awakened something that these three men were beginning to understand they should never have disturbed. The desert night was closing in around them now, painting everything in shades of deep purple and silver. The temperature was beginning to drop, but the three men found themselves sweating despite the cooling air. Thomas Begay remained perfectly still, his dark eyes reflecting the first stars that appeared overhead. The confrontation had shifted into something none of them had expected, and the silence that stretched between them was heavy with unspoken tension. Jake Morrison cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. Look, we're all reasonable men here. Maybe we've been approaching this wrong. Maybe there's a way to make this work for everyone. Thomas tilted his head slightly, studying the tall man with the beard as if he were examining an interesting specimen. Reasonable men, he repeated slowly. Tell me, Mr. Morrison, what makes a man reasonable? Is it the ability to justify taking what doesn't belong to him? Is it the skill to dress theft in the language of business and progress? The old warrior walked over to a small wooden bench beside his porch and sat down, his movements deliberate and unhurried. I knew a man once who considered himself very reasonable. His name was Colonel Henderson, and he was my commanding officer during my second tour in Vietnam. Pete shifted nervously, glancing toward the horses they had left tied to a nearby fence post. The animals were growing restless in the gathering darkness, sensing the tension that filled the air between their riders and the old man who seemed to command the very desert itself. Colonel Henderson was a career soldier, Thomas continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a storyteller sharing ancient wisdom around a campfire. West Point educated, from a military family that went back 4 generations. He believed deeply in following orders, maintaining discipline, and achieving objectives regardless of the cost. Thomas reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, worn smooth by decades of handling. From it, he withdrew a pinch of tobacco and sprinkled it on the ground in front of him, an offering to the spirits of his ancestors, a gesture that connected him to traditions older than the civilization these three men represented. Colonel Henderson was assigned to oversee a pacification program in a village called Dongha, Thomas said, his voice growing distant with memory. The objective was simple: convince the villagers to relocate to a government-controlled area where they could be properly protected and supervised. Billy found himself drawn into the story despite his fear and confusion. What happened? Thomas's eyes grew dark with remembrance. The villagers refused to leave. They had lived in that place for hundreds of years. Their ancestors were buried there. Their rice paddies and fishing grounds provided everything they needed to survive. To them, leaving was not relocation, it was cultural death. The old warrior paused, and, in that silence, the three men could hear the distant howl of coyotes beginning their nightly hunt. The sound seemed to echo across the desert like the voices of ghosts calling from some other world. Colonel Henderson was a reasonable man, Thomas continued. He offered the villagers new homes, compensation for their losses, protection from enemy forces. When they still refused, he increased the incentives. Money, medical care, education for their children. Everything a reasonable man might want. Jake Morrison felt a chill of recognition creeping up his spine. And when that didn't work, Thomas's smile returned, but now it carried the weight of old grief and hard-won wisdom. When that didn't work, Colonel Henderson decided the villagers were being unreasonable. He concluded they needed to be taught the consequences of refusing such generous offers. The old warrior stood and walked to the edge of his property, where the desert stretched away into infinite darkness. One morning, the villagers woke up to find their water supply contaminated. Chemical runoff from a nearby military base, the official report said. An unfortunate accident. Thomas turned back to face his unwelcome visitors, and, even in the dim light, they could see the pain that flickered across his weathered features. The next week, their rice paddies were destroyed by what was officially recorded as enemy sabotage. The week after that, their fishing boats were sunk during a routine patrol exercise. Pete swallowed hard, beginning to understand where this story was leading. What did you do? I watched, Thomas said simply. I watched reasonable men destroy people who had done nothing wrong except refuse to abandon everything that mattered to them. I watched as families that had lived in peace for generations were driven from their homes by a slow campaign of terror and intimidation. The old warrior's voice grew harder, carrying an edge that made all three men take an involuntary step backward. And I learned something important about reasonable men, Mr. Morrison. I learned that they're often the most dangerous people in the world because they can justify anything, any cruelty, any theft, any destruction, by convincing themselves it serves the greater good. Billy looked around nervously, suddenly aware of how isolated they were, how far from any help or reinforcement. That was war. This is different. We're not trying to hurt anybody. Thomas laughed, but it was not a sound of amusement. Not trying to hurt anybody. You come to my home with threats and intimidation. You insult my heritage and my family. You break bottles on my property and speak of making my life difficult. And you tell me you're not trying to hurt anybody. The old warrior walked back toward them, and they found themselves retreating without conscious thought. Let me ask you something, boys. What do you think will happen if you succeed? If you manage to drive me from this land, what becomes of the sacred places where my ancestors are buried? What happens to the springs where my people have drawn water for 1,000 years? What becomes of the stories and songs and ceremonies that are tied to this specific place? Jake Morrison tried to summon his earlier confidence. That's not our concern. This is about business, about development, about progress. Progress, Thomas repeated, and the words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Do you know what my grandfather called progress? He called it the white man's word for stealing everything worth having and then convincing the victims they should be grateful for the privilege. The old warrior reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and metallic, a tarnished silver star attached to a faded ribbon. This is the bronze star I earned in Vietnam. Do you know why they gave it to me? The three men stared at the metal in fascination, unable to look away from this tangible proof of the old man's military service. I earned this medal by doing something that Colonel Henderson thought was unreasonable, Thomas said quietly. I disobeyed a direct order. I was told to abandon a wounded comrade because extracting him would put the entire squad at risk. A reasonable order from a reasonable commander based on reasonable tactical assessments. Thomas held the metal up to catch the faint starlight, and it seemed to glow with its own inner fire. But I remembered something my grandfather taught me. He said that a man's worth is not measured by what he accomplishes when it's easy and safe. A man's worth is measured by what he's willing to sacrifice for what he believes is right. Billy felt his mouth go dry. So you went back for him? I went back for him, Thomas confirmed. Through 300 yards of open ground under heavy fire. Took 2 bullets in the process, one in the leg, one in the side. But I brought him home. The old warrior carefully tucked the metal back into his pocket. That wounded soldier was a 19-year-old kid from Alabama named Johnny Williams. White boy who had never seen an Indian before he met me. Full of all the stereotypes and prejudices you might expect. He called me Chief, just like you did earlier. Thomas's voice grew softer, more reflective. But when Johnny Williams woke up in that field hospital and realized what I had done, you know what he said to me? He said, I was wrong about your people, Thomas. I was wrong about everything. The old warrior looked directly at Jake Morrison, and the younger man felt as if those dark eyes could see straight through to his soul. Johnny Williams went home to Alabama and became a teacher. For 37 years, he taught children about respect and understanding and the danger of judging people by their race or religion or background. All because one unreasonable Indian refused to leave a man behind. Pete was growing increasingly agitated, his hand moving restlessly near his gun. This is all very touching, but it doesn't change anything. We got a job to do, and we're going to do it. Thomas's smile returned, and with it came that terrible sense of facing something far beyond their understanding or control. A job, he repeated thoughtfully. Yes, I suppose you do have a job. Tell me, what exactly did your employers tell you about me? Did they mention that I was a decorated Marine veteran? Did they tell you about my Congressional Medal of Honor nomination? Did they mention that I once testified before a Senate subcommittee about military contractors who were cheating soldiers out of their benefits? The 3 men exchanged glances, and Thomas could read the answer in their expressions. They didn't tell you any of that, did they? They just told you I was an old Indian on a worthless piece of desert land who could be easily intimidated into selling. Jake Morrison felt the last of his confidence evaporating like morning dew. That doesn't matter. A job's a job. A job's a job, Thomas agreed. But some jobs define the men who do them, and some men define the jobs they're willing to do. The question you need to ask yourselves is this. What kind of men are you? The old warrior walked over to his pickup truck and opened the driver's door, causing the interior light to come on. In that brief illumination, the 3 men could see photographs taped to the dashboard. Pictures of soldiers in jungle fatigues, of a young woman in a wedding dress, of children playing in the dust outside the very house they now stood before. I've spent my entire life asking myself that question, Thomas said quietly. In the jungles of Vietnam, when I had to choose between following orders and following my conscience. In the courtroom, when lawyers offer me money to change my testimony about what I had seen. Here on this land, when developers and mining companies and now your mysterious employers have tried to convince me that my connection to this place is worth less than their profit margins. Thomas closed the truck door, plunging them back into darkness. And every time, I have given the same answer. I'm Thomas Begay. I am the grandson of a man who walked 400 miles in chains rather than abandon his people. I am the son of a code talker who helped win a war while keeping his sacred language alive. I am a Marine who learned that honor is not about following orders, but about doing what's right regardless of the cost. The old warrior's voice grew stronger, carrying across the desert like a war cry passed down through generations. I'm a man who has seen the worst that humanity has to offer and has chosen to be better than his enemies. I am a protector of sacred places and ancient wisdom. I am a keeper of stories that must not be forgotten. Thomas stepped closer to the 3 men, and they found themselves backing away despite their weapons and their numbers. And I'm someone who will not be moved from this place by threats, bribes, or violence. This land is not for sale at any price, and I am not a man who can be intimidated by thugs and bullies, no matter how reasonable they think they are. The confrontation had reached a turning point. What had begun as a simple business transaction backed by implied force had become something much more complex and dangerous. The three men found themselves face to face with a force they had never encountered before. The immovable will of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. In the darkness of the desert night, with the stars watching overhead and the ancient spirits of the land seeming to gather around them, Thomas Begay stood like a pillar of stone against the storm. The broken bottle that had been intended to break his spirit had instead revealed the unbreakable core of a warrior's soul. The smile that had terrified Billy when the glass shattered remained on the old man's face. But now it carried something else as well. A certainty born of a lifetime of battles fought and, one, of principles tested and held firm, of a man who had looked into the abyss of human cruelty and had refused to become what he fought against. The three men were beginning to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. They had come expecting to intimidate a helpless old man and had instead awakened something far more dangerous than any of them were prepared to handle. The night was young, and the reckoning they had brought upon themselves was just beginning. The desert night had fully settled around them now, transforming the landscape into a realm of shadows and starlight. The three men found themselves caught in a situation that had spiraled far beyond their control, facing an adversary they had completely underestimated. Thomas Begay stood before them like an ancient monument carved from living stone, his presence somehow larger than his physical form. Jake Morrison made one last attempt to salvage the situation through intimidation. "You're making a big mistake, old man. Our employers have resources you can't imagine. They can make your life hell in ways you haven't even thought of." Thomas nodded slowly, as if considering the threat with genuine interest. "Resources," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I imagine they do. Money, connections, political influence, legal teams. All the tools that powerful men use to take what they want from those they consider powerless." The old warrior walked over to a weathered wooden post that marked the corner of his property. Carved into its surface were symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the starlight. Ancient Navajo markings that spoke of protection, of belonging, of sacred bonds that transcended mere legal ownership. "Let me tell you about resources, Mr. Morrison," Thomas said, running his fingers over the carved symbols with reverent care. "Let me tell you about the resources I command." Pete shifted nervously, his hand moving closer to his gun. "What are you talking about?" Thomas's smile widened, and in the darkness, it seemed to hold depths that went back through centuries of struggle and survival. "I'm talking about the power that comes from knowing your place in the world, young man. Not your place as others would define it, but your true place as determined by blood and bone and spirit." The old warrior gestured toward the distant mountains that loomed like sleeping giants against the star-filled sky. "Do you see those peaks? My ancestors hunted deer in those valleys for more than 1,000 years. They gathered medicine plants from those slopes, held ceremonies in those hidden canyons, raised their children in the shadow of those eternal stones." Thomas turned back to face his unwelcome visitors, and something about his posture had changed. Gone was the casual manner of an old rancher defending his property. In its place stood something ancient and implacable, a force that seemed to draw power from the very earth beneath his feet. "You speak of resources," Thomas continued, his voice carrying a resonance that seemed to echo off the surrounding mesas. "I have resources too. I have the accumulated wisdom of 30 generations of survivors. I have the strength that comes from knowing I stand on sacred ground. I have the backing of spirits that your employers cannot buy, threaten, or destroy." Billy laughed nervously, trying to dispel the growing sense of dread that was settling over him like a cold fog. "Spirits? Come on, old man. This is the 21st century, not some fantasy movie." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around them. The horses, still tied to the fence post, began to whinny and pull at their restraints. In the distance, the coyotes fell silent, and even the desert wind seemed to still, as if the very land was holding its breath. "The 21st century," Thomas repeated quietly. "Do you think time moves in straight lines, boy? Do you think the past is something that can be buried and forgotten? Do you think the bonds between a people and their land can be severed by calendars and clocks?" The old warrior reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather bag that hung from a cord around his neck. Even in the dim starlight, the three men could see that it was very old, worn smooth by countless hands and countless years. "This medicine bag belonged to my great-great-grandfather," Thomas said reverently. It contains sacred objects that have been passed down through my family for 7 generations. Stones from the 4 sacred mountains, soil from the place where the holy people first walked, blessed corn pollen that connects me to all living things. Thomas held the bag up toward the stars, and for a moment, the 3 men could swear they saw something. A flicker of light, a shimmer in the air, a presence that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. My great-great-grandfather carried this bag when he led war parties against the cavalry soldiers who tried to drive us from our homeland, Thomas continued. My great-grandfather carried it during the long walk, when our people were forced to march through the desert like prisoners of war. My grandfather carried it when he returned to reclaim this land, and my father carried it when he served as a code talker in the Pacific. The old warrior tucked the bag back inside his shirt, but the sense of otherworldly presence remained, growing stronger with each passing moment. Now, I carry it, and through it, I carry the strength and wisdom of all those who came before me. Through it, I am connected to powers that your employers with all their resources cannot comprehend, let alone challenge. Jake Morrison felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling night air. You're talking nonsense. Superstition. Primitive nonsense. Thomas's smile returned, but now it carried an edge that seemed to cut through the darkness like a blade. Primitive nonsense, he repeated. Tell me, Mr. Morrison, what is primitive about surviving genocide? What is nonsensical about maintaining cultural traditions for thousands of years despite every attempt to destroy them? What is superstitious about drawing strength from the same sources that sustained my ancestors through the worst suffering imaginable? The old warrior began to walk in a slow circle around the 3 men, his movements fluid and purposeful despite his age. With each step, the sense of being hunted rather than hunting grew stronger in their minds. You call my beliefs primitive, Thomas continued, but you're the ones who came here with guns and threats, who think violence is the answer to every problem. You call my connection to the land superstition, but you're the ones who worship money and power as if they were gods. Pete tried to rally his courage, raising his voice to break the hypnotic effect of Thomas's circling movement. Look, we didn't come here for a philosophical debate. We came here to make a deal. Are you going to sell or not? Thomas stopped directly in front of him, close enough that Pete could smell the sage smoke that clung to the old man's clothes and see the depths of experience in his dark eyes. You still don't understand, do you? This was never about a deal. This was never about business or progress or development. The old warrior's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow every word carried with perfect clarity across the desert silence. This was about power, about which of U.S. would prove stronger, about whether an old Indian could be intimidated by 3 young men with guns and attitudes. Thomas stepped even closer, and Pete found himself unable to move, trapped by the sheer force of the old man's presence. And now you know the answer to that question, don't you? Billy broke first. The accumulated tension, the unnatural atmosphere, the growing certainty that they were completely out of their depth, it all combined to shatter his nerve like glass hitting concrete. His hand flew to his gun, drawing it with the desperate speed of a man who knew he was drowning. That's enough, he shouted, his voice cracking with strain. I've had enough of your spooky Indian mumbo-jumbo. You're going to sell this land, or we're going to take it. The gun gleamed dully in the starlight, its barrel trained on Thomas's chest. For a moment, the tableau held, 3 men with weapons facing one old warrior with nothing but his smile and his unshakable certainty. Thomas looked down at the gun with mild interest, as if Billy were showing him an unusual insect or an interesting rock. So, he said conversationally, it comes down to this after all, the gun. The ultimate argument of men who have run out of better ideas. The old warrior raised his eyes to meet Billy's, and the younger man felt his finger freeze on the trigger. There was something in those dark depths that spoke of having faced death so many times that it had become an old friend, of having stared into the abyss so often that he was no longer afraid of what stared back. Do you know what your mistake is, boy? Thomas asked quietly. You think that gun makes you powerful. You think because you can threaten to take my life, you can force me to give up everything that makes that life worth living. Thomas began to walk toward Billy, moving slowly but steadily, never taking his eyes off the younger man's face. But I learned something 48 years ago in a jungle on the other side of the world. I learned that there are things worth dying for, and when you know what those things are, death loses its power over you. Billy's hand began to shake, the gun wavering as the old warrior approached with the inevitability of sunrise. "Stop! I'll shoot. I swear I'll shoot." "Yes," Thomas said calmly, continuing his advance. "I believe you will. And do you know what will happen then?" The distance between them had shrunk to less than 10 feet now, and still Thomas kept walking. "If you shoot me, you will prove that everything I have said about you is true. You will prove that you are nothing more than a common criminal, a thief who takes what he wants through violence and intimidation." 5 feet now, and Billy was backing up despite himself, the gun still trained on Thomas's chest, but his finger paralyzed on the trigger. "You will prove that your employers are cowards who send others to do their dirty work rather than face their victims with honest intentions." 3 feet, and Billy's back hit the fence post. He was trapped now, cornered by an old man who seemed utterly unconcerned by the weapon pointed at his heart. "And most importantly, you will prove that in the end, you had no power at all. No power to change my mind. No power to make me afraid. No power to do anything but destroy what you could not possess." Thomas stopped just out of arm's reach, his smile never wavering, his dark eyes reflecting starlight like chips of obsidian. "So go ahead, boy. Pull that trigger. Show me just how powerful you really are." The silence that followed was deafening. In that frozen moment, 3 would-be intimidators came face to face with the reality of what they had awakened. They had come expecting to face a helpless old man, and had instead encountered a force of nature, a living embodiment of everything they did not understand about strength, dignity, and the power that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. Billy's finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed, then tightened again. Sweat poured down his face as he struggled with the realization that shooting this old man would not be victory. It would be defeat in its most complete and humiliating form. Jake Morrison watched the confrontation with growing horror, understanding that whatever happened next, their mission had already failed. They had been sent to intimidate and had been intimidated instead. They had come to demonstrate power and had been shown what real power looked like. In the darkness of the desert night, under the eternal gaze of the stars, 3 men who thought they understood the world were learning that there were forces in it far older and stronger than anything they had ever imagined. And at the center of it all stood Thomas Begay, smiling that terrible, knowing smile, waiting to see what choice his enemies would make when faced with the truth about themselves. The standoff stretched across the desert night like a taut wire ready to snap. Billy stood frozen against the fence post, his gun still trained on Thomas Begay's chest, but his hand shaking so violently that the weapon seemed to have developed a life of its own. The old warrior remained perfectly still, his dark eyes locked on Billy's face with the patient intensity of a predator that had already won the hunt. Jake Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "Billy, put the gun down." "What?" Billy's voice was high and strained, almost unrecognizable. "Are you crazy? There's something wrong with him. Something really wrong." Thomas's smile widened slightly, and he tilted his head as if listening to something only he could hear. "Wrong," he repeated softly. "Or perhaps right in ways you've never encountered before." The old warrior took another step forward, and Billy pressed himself harder against the fence post, as if he could somehow merge with the wood and escape this nightmare. "You know what's really happening here, don't you, boy? You're finally meeting a man who cannot be bought, threatened, or intimidated. It's a new experience for you." Pete had his own gun out now, but his hands were no steadier than Billy's. "Stay back, old man. We don't want to hurt you, but we will if we have to." Thomas turned his attention to Pete, and the stocky man immediately regretted speaking. "Don't want to hurt me?" Thomas asked with genuine curiosity. "Then why did you come here with weapons? Why did you bring threats and insults? Why did you break a bottle on my property and speak of making my life difficult?" The old warrior's voice carried a weight of experience that seemed to press down on the 3 men like a physical force. "The truth is, you came here planning to hurt me. You came here planning to take something precious from me through fear and intimidation. The only thing that has changed is that your plan isn't working." Thomas began to move again, not directly toward any of them, but in that same slow circle that had unnerved them before. With each step, he seemed to grow larger, more imposing, as if he were drawing power from the very desert beneath his feet. "Let me tell you what's going to happen now," Thomas said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had faced death so many times it held no terror for him. "You're going to put away your guns and listen to what I have to say. Not because I'm threatening you, but because you need to understand something important before you leave my land." Billy's finger tightened on the trigger, but something in Thomas's tone made him hesitate. There was no fear in the old man's voice, no pleading or negotiation. Just a quiet certainty that was more unsettling than any threat could have been. "You came here tonight thinking you understood the world," Thomas continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of ancient storytelling. "You thought you understood power and weakness, strength and vulnerability. You thought you knew the difference between the hunter and the prey." The old warrior stopped in front of Jake Morrison, the apparent leader of the group, and looked directly into his eyes. "But you didn't understand anything at all, did you? You saw an old Indian on a piece of desert land, and you thought you saw weakness. You thought you saw someone who could be easily pushed around, easily intimidated, easily removed from something you wanted to possess." Jake tried to meet Thomas's gaze, but found himself looking away after only a few seconds. There was something in those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to the core of a man's soul, and what it found there was apparently not impressive. "You made the same mistake that soldiers made in Vietnam," Thomas said quietly. "The same mistake that cavalry officers made 150 years ago. The same mistake that every conqueror and colonizer has made throughout history. You mistook adaptation for weakness, patience for cowardice, and wisdom for ignorance." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stone, worn smooth by countless years of handling. Even in the dim starlight, it seemed to gleam with its own inner fire. "This stone came from a sacred mountain where my people first emerged into this world. My grandfather gave it to me when I left for Vietnam, and it has been with me through every battle I've ever fought." The old warrior held the stone up toward the stars, and for a moment, the three men could swear they felt something shift in the air around them, a presence and awareness, something that made them feel suddenly small and exposed under the vast dome of the desert sky. "Do you know what the stone taught me?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying with perfect clarity. "It taught me that true strength is not about destroying your enemies. True strength is about becoming something they cannot destroy." Billy's gun began to waver more violently, and sweat was now pouring down his face despite the cool night air. "What are you talking about? You're just one old man. We got guns. We got backup. We've got fear," Thomas interrupted gently. "You have fear. All the guns and backup in the world cannot hide that basic fact. You're afraid of me, afraid of what I represent, afraid of the possibility that everything you thought you knew about power and control might be wrong." The old warrior pocketed the stone and began walking toward Billy again, moving with that same unhurried certainty that had characterized all his movements throughout this confrontation. "And you should be afraid. Not because I'm going to hurt you. I have no intention of laying a hand on any of you. You should be afraid because you're finally meeting something your employers never prepared you for." "What?" Pete demanded, his voice cracking with strain. "What are we meeting?" Thomas stopped just out of arm's reach from Billy's gun and smiled that terrible, knowing smile. "You're meeting integrity. You're meeting a man who knows who he is and what he stands for, and who cannot be moved from that position by any force you can bring to bear." The old warrior's voice grew stronger, carrying across the desert like a war cry passed down through generations. "You're meeting the accumulated strength of 30 generations of survivors, the wisdom of ancestors who endured everything you can imagine, and, worse, the power that comes from being rooted in something larger than yourself." Thomas gestured broadly at the land around them, at the distant mountains, and the star-filled sky, and the endless expanse of desert that stretched away into darkness. "You're meeting the spirit of a people who have been counted out and written off and declared extinct more times than you can count, and who are still here, still strong, still connected to the sacred places that give life meaning." Billy's gun hand was shaking so violently now that he could barely keep the weapon pointed in Thomas's general direction. "You're just trying to psyche us out. Mind games. Psychological warfare. Psychological warfare," Thomas repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose that's one way to look at it. But there's another way as well. Sometimes what looks like warfare is actually education. Sometimes what seems like an attack is actually a gift." The old warrior took one more step forward, and Billy found himself staring into those dark eyes from less than 3 feet away. "I'm trying to teach you something, boy. I'm trying to show you that there are forces in this world that cannot be conquered by violence, values that cannot be purchased with money, and truths that cannot be destroyed by lies." Thomas's voice softened, taking on an almost paternal tone. "I'm trying to save you from making a mistake that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Because if you pull that trigger, if you choose violence over understanding, destruction over respect, you will become something you may not be able to live with." For the first time since the confrontation began, doubt began to creep into Billy's eyes. The absolute certainty that had driven him to draw his weapon was beginning to crack, replaced by a growing awareness that he was facing something far beyond his understanding or control. "I've seen men make that choice before," Thomas continued gently. "I've seen good men turn into something dark and broken because they thought the only way to solve their problems was through violence. I've seen soldiers come home from war so damaged by what they had done that they couldn't look their own children in the eyes." The old warrior's voice carried the weight of genuine compassion now, the understanding of someone who had seen too much suffering and wanted to prevent more. "Don't be one of those men, Billy. Don't let your employers turn you into something you'll spend the rest of your life trying to forget." Billy's gun hand began to lower, almost against his will. But they told us. "They told you lies," Thomas said simply. "They told you I was weak, defenseless, easily intimidated. They told you this would be simple, quick, profitable. They told you whatever they needed to tell you to get you to come here and do their dirty work." The old warrior stepped back, giving Billy space to breathe, space to think, space to choose. "But now you know the truth. Now you've seen what you're really up against. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" Jake Morrison finally found his courage, or at least a pale imitation of it. "This isn't over, old man. Even if we walk away tonight, this isn't over. Our employers don't give up easy." Thomas turned to face him, and Jake immediately regretted speaking. "You're right," the old warrior said calmly. "This isn't over. It's just beginning. Because now your employers are going to learn something they've apparently never learned before." Thomas's smile returned, but now it carried something new, not just the terrible certainty of a man who could not be intimidated, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew exactly what was coming next. They're going to learn that there are still places in this world where money cannot buy what it wants, where power cannot simply take what it desires, where respect must be earned rather than demanded. Thomas's voice grew stronger with each word, carrying across the desert like a promise and a warning combined. They're going to learn that when you threaten a man's sacred places, when you attack everything he holds dear, when you try to destroy his connection to his ancestors and his land, you don't create a victim. You create an enemy. And not just any enemy. You create the most dangerous kind of enemy there is. Pete swallowed hard. "What kind?" Thomas's smile widened, and in that expression, the three men finally understood what they had truly awakened. The kind who has absolutely nothing left to lose and absolutely everything worth fighting for. The old warrior turned and began walking back toward his house, his movements casual and unhurried despite the 3 guns still trained on him. "You can report back to your employers that Thomas Begay sends his regards," he called over his shoulder. "Tell them that if they want this land, they're welcome to come and take it themselves. Tell them I'll be waiting." As he reached his porch, Thomas paused and turned back to face the 3 men one final time. "And tell them something else," he added, his voice carrying across the desert night with the authority of prophecy. "Tell them that some battles are won not by destroying your enemy, but by showing them who they really are. Tonight, you've learned who you are. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" With that, Thomas Begay walked into his house and closed the door behind him, leaving 3 shaken men standing in the desert darkness with their weapons and their shattered illusions. The confrontation was over, but the real battle, the battle for understanding, for respect, for the recognition of what could not be bought or stolen or intimidated away, was just beginning. In the silence that followed, as the 3 men slowly holstered their guns and walked back to their horses on unsteady legs, the desert itself seemed to bear witness to what had transpired. The ancient spirits of the land, the accumulated wisdom of 30 generations of survivors, the unbreakable will of a warrior who had learned that true strength came not from what you could destroy, but from what you refused to let be destroyed. All of it had been present in that smile, that terrible, knowing smile that had followed the breaking of a bottle and had revealed the breaking of something far more important. The three men who rode away into the desert night were not the same men who had arrived with such confidence hours before. They had been changed by their encounter with something they had never expected to find, a man who could not be broken, could not be bought, and could not be made to abandon what he held sacred. They carried with them now the knowledge of their own limitations, their own fears, and their own capacity for becoming something they might not be able to live with. Behind them, in the small adobe house on the edge of the reservation, Thomas Begay sat on his porch once again, a fresh cup of coffee in his hands, and that same terrible, wonderful smile on his weathered face. He had won this battle not with weapons or threats, but with something far more powerful, the absolute certainty of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. The desert wind carried the sound of retreating hoofbeats across the landscape, and with it carried the whispers of ancient voices singing songs of victory and survival. The land would remain sacred. The ancestors would rest undisturbed. And somewhere in the darkness, three men were learning what it meant to face an enemy who could not be defeated because he had already won the only battle that truly mattered, the battle for his own soul.